The morning sun peeked through the leaves of the old oak that guarded my front lawn, casting a dappled pattern on the concrete path leading to my porch. It was a peaceful moment, the kind that whispered promises of a quiet day. I sipped my coffee, savoring the bitter warmth, and settled into my favorite chair. It was a comfortable old thing, a bit too large for the porch perhaps, but its faded blue cushions held the kind of memories that made it irreplaceable. The tranquility, however, was shattered by the abrupt appearance of Karen from 3 doors down. Her arrival was like a summer storm, sudden, unannounced, and carrying the potential for chaos. She strode across the street with a purpose, a clipboard clutched in one hand like a scepter. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, darted over my porch before landing on me with the intensity of a spotlight. Karen's reputation preceded her. She was the self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood aesthetics, a stickler for rules both written and imagined. Her presence on the HOA board was palpable, if unofficial. Her crusades for conformity often left a trail of exasperated neighbors in their wake. For months, I'd watched her antics with a mix of amusement and exasperation, opting for quiet diplomacy in the face of her imperious demands. This morning, her grievance was my chair. Its slightly weathered appearance, which I thought added character, was a blight on her vision of suburban perfection. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming a litany of complaints that I could predict with unsettling accuracy. But, in truth, her words were unnecessary. The clipped, precise gestures of her pen, the accusatory angle of her eyebrows, spoke volumes. I considered my response carefully. My instinct was to diffuse, to redirect the brewing storm into a gentle breeze. I nodded understandingly, offering a non-verbal agreement to address her concerns. But inwardly, I pondered the irony of it all. The chair was but a symbol, a stand-in for her need to control the uncontrollable. The irony deepened with the soft ring of my phone, a subtle interruption that briefly diverted her attention. A message from the actual HOA board, confirming once again my recent appointment to the presidency. It was a detail I had yet to share with the neighborhood at large, preferring to navigate the transition with understated grace. Karen continued her tirade, oblivious to the shifting sands beneath her feet. I found myself pondering the nature of power, not as a force wielded, but as a quiet resilience. My position afforded me opportunities, yes, but also responsibilities. And with Karen, perhaps, a chance to demonstrate a more balanced approach to community living. The confrontation reached its inevitable pause, her final words hanging in the air with the weight of expectation. For a moment, I considered revealing the truth, letting the knowledge of my role wash over her like a cold shower. But then, I thought better of it. Timing was everything. I stood, not to assert authority, but to convey appreciation for her concerns. A neighbor's complaint was not the enemy, but a chance for dialogue, for understanding. And in that moment of silent acknowledgement, I saw a flicker of confusion cross her face, as if the script she followed so religiously had suddenly been rewritten. As she turned to leave, clipboard still clutched like a shield, I watched her go with a quiet smile. The chair, with its stories and scars, remained defiantly in place, a testament to the complexity of living alongside one another. In the days that followed, I knew there would be more skirmishes, more chances to bridge divides. But for now, I was content to sip my coffee, embrace the morning, and let the future unfold, one moment at a time. The morning light filtered through my kitchen window, brushing everything with a golden hue that belied the storm brewing just outside. It was a serene beginning to what I knew would be a day drenched in drama. Karen's drama. The minutes ticked by, each a silent countdown to her inevitable arrival, like distant thunder foretelling a tempest. Yesterday's confrontation still lingered in my thoughts, Karen had called 911 over a porch chair, a ludicrous escalation, but that was just the prologue. Today, Karen would sharpen her talons, fueled by indignation and a penchant for chaos. Sure enough, the tranquility shattered as the email notification chimed. Karen had unleashed her first salvo, a list of grievances longer than a child's Christmas wish list. Each item was more absurd than the last. My trash bins weren't aligned to her satisfaction. The shade of my curtains clashed with the neighborhood's aesthetic. And the bird feeder, the one that brought robins and sparrows to my garden, was apparently an invitation for vermin. Delightfully imaginative, yet completely nonsensical. Her creativity knew no bounds. A citation followed for my front yard's alleged, unapproved solar lights. They were actually my wife's garden lights, meticulously arranged to mimic a starry night sky. A subtle nod to her love for astronomy. But Karen saw them as an affront to neighborhood decorum. Inside, I couldn't help but chuckle at the irony. She had no idea I was the HOA president, a fact that would, for now, remain my little secret. The day unfolded with Karen's predictable antics. She flitted door to door, spreading tales of my supposed infractions. Her voice, a high-pitched melody of discontent, carried over front lawns like a feeble siren song. Neighbors listened, some nodding in forced agreement, others offering her polite indifference. But gossip, like a weed, has a way of taking root. I watched from my window, sipping coffee. Her performance was a spectacle, each gesture deliberate, every grimace practiced. It was almost admirable, the lengths she would go to assert her imagined authority. But beneath her crusade, I sensed desperation, a need to control, to shape the world in her likeness, as if pruning hedges. As the sun dipped, casting long shadows across the street, Karen's campaign slowed. The neighborhood, weary of her theatrics, retreated behind closed doors. But the day's events had sown seeds of discord. Her whispers were like the wind, unseen but felt, rustling through the community. Later, the phone rang. A single line from a neighbor, the words tinged with the absurdity of it all. "Is it true you're being fined for your garden gnomes?" I laughed, the sound a release of tension, knowing full well it was only beginning. Karen's web of tales was intricate, yet fragile. Tomorrow, the real act would begin. The board meeting loomed, an arena where veils would drop and truths would surface. For now, though, I savored the quiet, the calm, before Karen's next tempest. She was a storm I was prepared to weather, armed with patience and a steady resolve. Tonight the stars above my garden twinkled with knowing light. They too understood the irony, the dance of power and pettiness, of rules and revelations yet to unfold. There is a peculiar solace in the calm before a storm, a deceptive serenity. I found it in the days following Karen's spectacular unraveling. Her 911 stunt over my innocuous porch chair had been her pièce de résistance, a theatrical crescendo in her symphony of pettiness. Yet, the ensuing silence felt less like resolution and more like a prelude. I immersed myself in the mundane beauty of documentation. The act of writing can feel like casting spells, each stroke on paper a quiet incantation. I compiled her transgressions meticulously, stitching them together with a thread of patience and wry humor. Every ridiculous altercation, every passive-aggressive note, every time she had weaponized the HOA rulebook against an unsuspecting neighbor, became a neatly cataloged testament to her reign of terror. My office, with its warm oak bookshelves and the soft golden light filtering through the window, became a war room. Maps of strategy splayed across my desk, a strategic counteroffensive, subtle yet devastating. I wanted to be thorough, ensuring that my move would be as imperceptible as the dawn, creeping in until it was inevitable. Her reaction to my presidency had, of course, been less than gracious. The color had drained from her face, her mouth opening in a soft, silent O of shock. But this was not about revenge. This was about balance, about restoring equilibrium, about reminding her that the HOA was not her personal fiefdom. She was the kind of person who thrived on conflict, like a fire needing only the slightest gust to rekindle. I knew that direct confrontation would only feed her flames. Instead, I planned a subtle shift in the winds, a proposal at the next HOA meeting, an amendment to the bylaws, a call for kindness, for community support over pedantry. The meeting room buzzed with the murmur of neighbors, a tapestry of voices woven together by shared frustration and weary amusement. Karen sat at the end of the table, her posture a fortress of defiance. I presented the proposal with calm authority, painting a vision of a neighborhood where empathy reigned over nitpicking. My words wove through the room, wrapping around each attendee, binding us in a quiet conspiracy of decency. For a moment, the room paused. Perched on the precipice of change, eyes flickered between Karen and me, anticipation crackling through the air. Then, a voice broke the tension. A neighbor speaking up in agreement. Another followed. Karen's fortress crumbled, brick by imperious brick. Her eyes darted, searching for support, but finding none. And there it was, a quiet victory, a shift as imperceptible as the turning tide. Later, I watched from my window as she left the meeting, her steps unsteady. There was no relish in her defeat, only a sense of rightness, a return to the harmony she had so long disturbed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a neighborhood washed clean by its own resilience. My porch chair remained defiantly unremarkable, a silent witness to the power of turning the other cheek, with a knowing, strategic smile. From the moment Karen stormed away from my porch, her heels clattering against the pavement like a judge's gavel, a strange quiet settled over the neighborhood. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next act in this suburban drama. I could feel the eyes of my neighbors peering from behind curtains, their curiosity piqued by the silent tug-of-war unfolding on our street. It didn't take long for whispers to flutter through the neighborhood like leaves in a restless wind. Karen, with her penchant for discipline and her ever-hovering presence, had cast herself as the guardian of our community's aesthetic sanctity. Yet, for all her attempts at control, she had misread the landscape. I could sense the shift, a subtle yet undeniable revolt against her tyranny. Neighbors, once united under the common flag of HOA regulations, began to question the rules. Small acts of rebellion sprouted like wildflowers in an untended field. A garden gnome appeared in the Johnsons' front yard, unapologetic amidst the meticulously trimmed hedges. The sound of wind chimes tinkling from the Andersons' porch was a melody of quiet defiance. I maintained my stance, calm and unyielding, like a lighthouse amidst a brewing storm. As the newly revealed HOA president, my role was not to retaliate but to observe, to let the neighborhood find its balance. There was power in stillness, in allowing others to discover the hollowness of Karen's arguments on their own. Karen, however, was not one to back down easily. Her vigilance increased, her patrols more frequent. She was a hawk circling the skies, searching for the slightest deviation from her rigid standards. But with each visit, her authority seemed to erode just a little more. Her wings clipped by the growing realization that the community was slipping from her grasp. Days passed, and the air grew thick with anticipation. The annual neighborhood meeting loomed on the horizon, a gathering that promised to be anything but routine. As the evening approached, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a tapestry of bruised purples and fiery oranges, an omen, perhaps, of the confrontation to come. I arrived early, greeted by the murmurs of neighbors clustered in small groups, their hushed conversations punctuated by glances towards the entrance. Karen stood at the center, a solitary figure trying to maintain her composure, her smile as brittle as autumn leaves underfoot. The meeting room was a microcosm of our community. Neat rows of chairs filled with faces both familiar and distant. As I took my place at the head, a hush fell over the crowd. It was a silence heavy with expectation, the weight of unspoken grievances hanging in the air like fog on a winter morning. I knew the moment required action. Words, carefully chosen, would be my tools. As I addressed the room, I could feel the collective breath of the neighborhood, a fragile thread connecting us all. I spoke of unity, of flexibility, of the need to adapt as a community to the evolving world around us. Without naming names, I outlined the vision of a neighborhood built on mutual respect and understanding, rather than fear and control. Karen's eyes, once sharp as daggers, softened to shadows. The realization of her isolation swept over her, visible in the subtle slump of her shoulders. It was a moment of poignancy wrapped in irony, a dramatic twist that revealed the true power balance. In the end, the meeting wasn't just about chairs or gardens. It was about reclaiming the narrative of our neighborhood, about reminding ourselves of the community we wish to be. As the room echoed with the sound of approval, I knew that change was more than possible. It was inevitable. Karen's reign had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, resolute murmur of collective will. In the stillness that followed, I felt the neighborhood breathe a sigh of relief, the promise of something new unfurling in the gentle night breeze. The autumn air carried a chill that seeped into the bones, whispering of change. Outside my window, leaves tumbled in a silent dance, their descent graceful yet inevitable. My gaze drifted from the kaleidoscope of colors outside to the stack of papers on my desk, each sheet a stepping stone in a plan meticulously crafted over quiet evenings. Karen's call to the police over my porch chair had been a storm in a teacup, a tempest of indignation swirling around wrought iron and weather-resistant fabric. She'd believed herself the queen of the neighborhood, wielding bylaws like a scepter. Her mistake was in thinking I was merely another pawn. It was time to lead with the king. I sipped my coffee, its warmth a balm against the morning's chill. The papers were a neat pile of legalese and signatures, an orchestra of change in black and white. I had taken the time to research thoroughly, to understand the landscape of bylaws and governance that Karen so fervently clung to. Knowledge was power, after all, but its true strength lay in its application. Karen had always seen authority as a hammer, something to bludgeon others into submission. I saw it more like a sculptor's chisel, capable of shaping the world subtly and with precision. My role as president of the HOA was not something I flaunted. No, I wielded it quietly, preferring the steadiness of a guiding hand to the bluster of commands. I had no intention of retaliating with fire and brimstone. Instead, I chose a path that would transform her fortress of rules into a gallery of understanding. The ink on the HOA amendment forms was dry now, ready for the next board meeting. It wasn't about removing authority, but about tempering it with empathy and inclusiveness. Some people saw laws as cages. I saw them as frameworks capable of expansion. The meeting convened in the usual manner, the room buzzing with the energy of civic duty and coffee. Karen sat across from me, her eyes flinty with suspicion. I could feel her gaze like the prick of needles. There was no need to return it with animosity. My focus was the community we both claimed to serve. As the discussion turned to the proposed amendments, I watched the room gauge the changes. They were subtle, meant to foster community spirit rather than stifle it, a nod towards more flexible guidelines for personal space use, a suggestion for a community garden, an initiative to encourage open dialogue. The words flowed like a gentle stream, reshaping the landscape of our shared neighborhood. Karen's face was a study in controlled fury, a simmering pot held just below boiling. But then came the curious tilt of a head, the gradual unwinding of tension as realization dawned. The amendments were not the wildfire she had anticipated, but rather seeds planted for growth. In that moment, Karen's silence was the loudest sound in the room. The irony hung heavy in the air. Her need for control had led to her undoing. A community cannot be governed by fear, only by mutual respect. As the vote passed, the tide shifted, leaving Karen's reign as a cautionary tale of hubris. The meeting concluded, chairs scraping against the floor as attendees dispersed. I lingered, gathering my papers with a calm deliberation. Outside, the sun emerged from behind clouds, casting warm light through the window. It seemed fitting, a closing note of hope in a symphony of change. Karen's footsteps approached, a hesitant rhythm. When words finally came, they were quiet, almost fragile. I didn't expect this. Her voice, stripped of bravado, held a kernel of realization. I met her gaze with a steady calm. In the silence that followed, understanding blossomed. We were not so different after all, both seeking order, though our methods had diverged. The air between us was no longer charged with animosity, but with the possibility of cooperation. As I stepped into the afternoon light, I felt the weight of the past lift. The neighborhood was just a little brighter, no longer overshadowed by a single will. Change had come softly, but it had come nonetheless. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows over the neighborhood, wrapping each house in a warm, gentle glow. A serene calm had returned after the tumultuous storm Karen had stirred. The street, once a battleground of whispered complaints and silent judgments, now stood quiet, as if holding its collective breath. My front porch chair, the unlikely catalyst of this drama, sat resolutely where it always had, a symbol of quiet rebellion and ultimately triumph. I watched through the window, the glass cool against my forehead, as neighbors began to emerge, cautiously at first, like deer testing the air for predators. The tension that had gripped the community had eased, replaced by a tentative camaraderie, a shared understanding of having weathered a storm together. Each nod and wave exchanged between houses felt like the stitching of a quilt mending itself from the center outward. Karen, on the other hand, had receded into the backdrop. Her once frequent patrols up and down the sidewalk, eyes scanning for infractions like a hawk, had stopped. The community had chosen sides, and she had found herself curiously alone. It was ironic how someone so used to being in control could find herself sidelined in such a profound way. The realization must have hit her like a cold wind. Earlier that day, I had received the official resignation letter. Crisp, formal, with just a hint of bitterness hidden between the lines. Karen had stepped down from the HOA board. It was not unexpected, but the impact was no less significant. Her reign of heavy-handed enforcement had ended, swept away by a tide of collective will and quiet resilience. The community had spoken, not with loud voices or angry words, but through a simple refusal to bow to tyranny. Her absence was palpable. The street almost felt wider without her looming presence. Yet, there was a lingering sense of something unsaid, a loose thread that needed to be tied off. It was in this moment of reflection that I decided to pay Karen a visit, to offer an olive branch of sorts. Or perhaps just to see the woman behind the mask one last time. Her house was immaculate, as always, the lawn trimmed with precision, the flowers in the garden obediently blooming. I approached slowly, allowing my steps to match the rhythm of my thoughts. What would I say? How would she respond? Would there be anger, regret, or simply a silent acceptance of a new reality? I knocked softly, the sound barely audible over the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. When the door opened, Karen stood there, her usual stern expression softened by an unfamiliar weariness. Her eyes, once full of fire and determination, now held a quiet resignation.
See,
"This isn't what I wanted," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first unguarded moment I'd seen from her, a glimpse of vulnerability behind the fortress she'd built so carefully around herself. And in that moment, I understood. It was never about the chair. It was about control, about belonging, about identity in a world that often felt too large and impersonal. I let the silence stretch between us, a bridge across the chasm of misunderstanding. "Let's make it better," I finally replied. Few words, but they carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. As I turned to leave, I felt the shift. The air seemed lighter, the world a little less burdened. Karen would find her place again, perhaps not as the enforcer she once was, but as part of the fabric of the community she had tried so hard to shape. We all make mistakes, I thought. It's what we do afterward that counts. Walking back to my house, I passed by the chair, my faithful sentinel. It had stood through it all, unchanged, unyielding. A reminder that sometimes quiet strength speaks louder than any voice raised in anger. The neighborhood was settling into a new rhythm, one of understanding and acceptance. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange, I felt a serene satisfaction. The storm had passed, and we were still standing, stronger, together.